The sun dipped below the rugged horizon, casting an orange glow over the sprawling expanse of the Crawford Ranch. The land stretched out for miles, endless fields, dry, cracked earth, and a quiet stillness that only West Texas could offer. It was peaceful, almost serene, but the vastness of it could make a person feel small, insignificant. Even for Garrett Crawford, it was home, and for his wife Sarah, it was all they had left. It was late afternoon, just before the twilight. Garrett had mentioned needing to check on a rattling noise coming from the old John Deere tractor. He hadn't seemed worried when he walked out, with the house just as usual, quiet, self-focused, determined. Sarah had waved him off with a smile, knowing he'd be back in just a few minutes, like he always did. But minutes turned into an hour, and as the sun began to slip further beneath the horizon, Sarah's unease started to grow. The darkness of the desert was beginning to take over, and with it the quieter silence that felt as if it were swallowing everything. She walked to the front porch, calling his name, her voice barely reaching past the boundary of their yard. The sound disappeared into the vastness of the land, lost somewhere between the wind and the whisper of distant cattle. She didn't think much of it at first. Garrett had always been absorbed in his work, especially when something wasn't right with his machines. But as the shadows lengthened and the chirping of crickets filled the space around her, an anxious knot twisted in her stomach. She called his name again, and again nothing. She made her way to Garrett's truck. The dusty Ford F-150 sat just where it always did, driver's side door slightly ajar. A heavy weight settled in her chest when she saw the keys resting on the passenger seat, next to a small pile of receipts from the feed store. His wallet wasn't there, nothing new, but the keys. Garrett never went anywhere without them. It was more than just his transport. It was his lifeline to the world beyond the ranch. He didn't leave without it. The truck felt empty. A chill ran through her, and she hurried back to the house. Her steps quickened as she checked every room, every corner. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something was wrong, and she couldn't explain it. By the time she dialed the number for the sheriff's department, it was already nearly dark. Her fingers trembled as she held the phone to her ear, the static in the line not masking the fear in her voice. "Hello, my husband is missing. He went out to check the tractor, and he never came back. Please, we need help." The dispatcher's calm voice was a stark contrast to the panic in Sarah's chest, but it offered little comfort. She was just another woman calling for help in the middle of nowhere. Another case, another search, but this wasn't just another missing person. This was Garrett. Her husband, a deputy named Rick Ortega, was assigned to the call. His patrol car's headlights cut through the night, sweeping across the long gravel road that led to the Crawford Ranch. His car was the first sign of life Sarah had seen in hours. When Ortega arrived, the sky above the ranch was dark, filled with a scattering of stars too many to count. It was so quiet, it felt like the land was holding its breath. He was a young officer, still new enough to the force that he hadn't seen everything this desert could hide. But something about the ranch felt different. The isolation, the silence. He could tell immediately this wasn't just a case of a man wandering off. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the air. Ortega listened as Sarah recounted everything. How Garrett had been distant lately, how the ranch's debts weighed heavy on him, the drought, the never-ending struggle to keep the family legacy afloat, and how, despite it all, Garrett had never done anything like this before. Never just disappeared. Not without a word. They walked to the barn, the flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. The barn, always filled with the familiar smells of hay, motor oil, and earth, was quieter tonight still. The sliding door was open just a crack the way Garrett had left it. The air inside was thick enough to feel like a weight pressing down on her chest. It was all so normal. Too normal that there were no signs of a struggle. No overturned feed sacks, no blood, no signs of panic, but something was off. Ortega's flashlight landed on a heavy combination wrench, discarded on the packed dirt floor, directly under the engine block of the old John Deere. It was out of place. It shouldn't have been there. Garrett had clearly been interrupted. But by what, or by who? They searched the barn, their flashlights dancing across the walls, their feet crunching through the dirt. No answers, no clues, just emptiness. Back in the kitchen, Ortega took their formal statements. Sarah and Ben spoke of Garrett's quiet nature, his stoic resolve. They spoke of the ranch's struggles, the constant fear of losing it all. But they also spoke of the man Garrett was: strong, dependable, unwavering. There was no way he would just walk away, not from everything he had worked for. But as the hours stretched on, the darkness outside seemed to stretch with them, as if the night would never end. Eventually, Ortega had no choice but to make the call. Garrett Crawford was officially missing, and with that, the first wave of the search began. The initial theory was simple. Garrett had walked away, overwhelmed by the financial pressures. It wasn't unheard of. People cracked under the weight of it all. But Sarah knew in her heart that wasn't the case. Garrett had never been the type to run. And so, as the night grew colder, Sarah stood in the silence of their kitchen, a deep gnawing fear settling over her. She couldn't explain it, but something told her this wasn't just a man overwhelmed by life's troubles. Something terrible had happened. Something she couldn't yet understand, but she would. She had to. The chapter closes with the weight of the unknown hanging over her. Sarah staring out into the dark Texas night, knowing that the land she had lived on her whole life would no longer feel the same. The search had just begun, but the fear that something far more sinister was at play had already taken root. The days after Garrett's disappearance blurred together, each one darker than the last. The desert, with its vast, unyielding emptiness, felt like a place where nothing could hide. And yet, somehow, Garrett had vanished without a trace. The search was relentless. Volunteers, law enforcement, helicopters cutting through the sky, and search dogs sniffing through the dirt. But no matter how far they spread, no matter how many people combed the land, it was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. It was a strange kind of cruelty, that vast, empty silence. The kind of silence that presses against you, that makes you question your own thoughts. Days passed, then weeks, and yet there was still no sign of Garrett. Sarah stood in the doorway of their ranch house, her eyes scanning the horizon. It was the same view she'd seen 1,000 times before, the same land that had nurtured their family, the same earth that had held their memories. But now, every inch of it seemed different. It seemed colder. The vast expanse that had once been comforting now felt oppressive, as if it were mocking her helplessness. She clung to a single thread of hope, a fragile belief that Garrett hadn't disappeared, not really, that he had just walked away. Maybe he just needed time, she told herself quietly. Standing alone on the porch, the thought was both comforting and unbearable. Garrett had always been a quiet man, a man of routine. But was it possible that the weight of everything, the failing ranch, the endless debt, the pressure, had broken him? Had he simply given up and left, leaving her to pick up the pieces? Her mind raced through 1,000 possibilities, none of them comforting. She tried to convince herself that Garrett would never leave her, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. It couldn't be. In the days that followed, Detective Miles Corbin took over the investigation. A seasoned veteran with years of experience, Corbin didn't let emotion cloud his judgment. He was methodical, pragmatic, and while Sarah appreciated his professionalism, a part of her couldn't help but feel like he was just going through the motions, checking boxes, following the trail of debts and paperwork, without truly understanding the depth of what was at stake. Corbin's focus quickly shifted to Garrett's financials. Bank statements, loan papers, unpaid bills. He sifted through them like a detective piecing together a puzzle. "Looks like Garrett's debts were piling up," Corbin said one afternoon, his voice steady as he laid out the evidence. The ranch, the loans, the bank notices. It wasn't just the drought, it was everything. The financial pressure would have been unbearable. Sarah nodded, her heart sinking as she listened. She had known about the bills, of course, but hearing it laid like that, it made everything feel final, as if the weight of the ranch's collapse was the only thing that had finally broken Garrett's spirit. But that wasn't what troubled Sarah the most. What troubled her was the lack of anything concrete, no sign of struggle, no clues, no footprints leading away from the barn, no sign that Garrett had ever left at all. Weeks passed. Sarah tried to go through the motions of daily life, keeping the ranch alive, feeding the cattle, fixing what little she could. But her mind was never far from Garrett, and the more time passed, the more the unanswered questions gnawed at her. Then, just as the investigation seemed to lose steam, a phone call brought a flicker of hope. A cashier at a truck stop 150 miles away called the sheriff's office. She claimed to have seen a man matching Garrett's description. He was thin, disheveled, tired. She remembered him from a few days after Garrett had disappeared. He had bought coffee, stared out the window, and then left without a word. Sarah's heart skipped when she heard it. Could it be? Could Garrett be alive? Could he have been out there, somewhere, trying to survive? The thought brought a surge of adrenaline, a fleeting moment of belief. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe Garrett hadn't just left them. Maybe something had happened, something that had kept him from coming home. Maybe he's still out there, she whispered to herself, pressing the phone to her ear, the hope rising inside her like a tidal wave. But the lead soon evaporated. Detective Corbin and Deputy Ortega traveled to the truck stop, hoping to catch a glimpse of Garrett. But when they reviewed the security footage, it was inconclusive at best. The man in the video looked somewhat like Garrett, but it was too blurry, too grainy to tell for sure. The cashier, despite her certainty, couldn't offer any more information. The hope that had surged so quickly now faded, leaving Sarah feeling hollow. She stood in the kitchen late that night, staring at the phone, willing it to ring again. The silence was unbearable. She had thought, for just a moment, that she might get Garrett back, that the search might end with him walking through that door. But as the days dragged on, reality set in again. There were no answers, no new leads, just more uncertainty, more silence. And then, that terrible thought crept into Sarah's mind once again. Had Garrett simply left? Had he walked away from everything they had built together? She had no answers, only more questions. And the more she thought about it, the harder it became to believe he could just abandon them. She closed her eyes, tears threatening to break free. "Why, Garrett, why?" she whispered into the emptiness. The chapter ends with Sarah staring into the darkness outside the kitchen window, the weight of her questions pressing down on her chest, and for the first time, she wonders if she will ever truly know what happened to Garrett Crawford. It had been 6 months. 6 long months since Garrett Crawford had walked out of the house on a quiet October evening to check on the tractor and never returned. The days dragged on, each one blending into the next, until Sarah couldn't remember what it felt like to wake up without the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her chest. The ranch had become a hollow version of what it once was. The fences needed mending, the cattle still needed feeding, but it wasn't the same. Every task, every chore felt heavier now. Ben, too, had grown quiet. His youthful optimism had been replaced with a weariness that wasn't supposed to belong to someone his age. They were both stuck, moving through their days like shadows of the lives they used to lead, both trying to fill the void left behind by Garrett. Sarah stood by the barn, watching Ben work in the field, his figure small against the vast empty land. The wind whispered through the tall grasses, carrying with it the smell of dust and sweat. Every corner of the ranch seemed to echo with Garrett's absence, each familiar sound only amplifying the hollow silence. She missed his voice, his steady presence, even the way he'd grumble under his breath when things weren't going right. He wasn't just her husband, he was the anchor of their world. But now, there was nothing, just this sprawling emptiness. She ran her fingers through her hair, pulling herself back from the thought. There was work to do, and for Ben's sake, she had to keep moving forward, even if it felt like she was walking in circles. The emotional toll was wearing on her, though. Every phone call with the authorities felt like a reminder of how little they cared. Garrett's case was growing cold. The search had been called off long ago, and the only thing that remained of her husband was the theory. Garrett had walked away, overwhelmed by the weight of his failing ranch. Detective Miles Corbin, now the lead investigator on the case, had all but resigned himself to that theory. He was a methodical man, and as the weeks passed, he'd started to believe Garrett, under pressure from the drought, the mounting debts, and the weight of his family legacy, had simply vanished, choosing to abandon everything he'd worked for. The lack of clues seemed to support that conclusion, but then, something strange happened. Corbin had been going through the mountain of paperwork again, trying to make sense of it all when something caught his eye. It was a check tucked into a pile of receipts, one that hadn't been cashed. It was from a cattle auction house, and it was made out to Garrett for a sum that could have kept them afloat for months. A check that had never been deposited. Why would he leave that behind? Corbin muttered to himself, flipping the check over, studying the details. He'd read it over and over again, but the answer didn't make sense. If Garrett had been fleeing his debts, if he had truly run away, why would he leave behind an amount of money that could have bought him time? Time to get away. Time to escape the life he was tied to. Corbin paused. His mind, usually confident and clear, couldn't reconcile the evidence. The check didn't fit, didn't add up. At the same time, Sarah was struggling with her own growing doubts. She could feel it. Deep in her gut, something wasn't right. Garrett wouldn't have left her, not like this, not with everything still left unfinished. The debts, the ranch, their life together, it had all been too important to him. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper to the story, something they weren't seeing. She started to investigate on her own, combing through Garrett's things in the house, his desk, his notebooks, his receipts, anything that might give her a clue, and that's when she found it. A name that kept cropping up in his notes: Dale Rowe. Dale Rowe was a man Garrett had done business with for years, a traveling salesman who dealt with farm supplies. But there was more to it, Sarah realized, as she read through the notes. There was tension there, beneath the surface. She remembered the arguments they'd had, the way Garrett had spoken about Rowe, the quiet anger in his voice. It was rare for Garrett to get worked up about anything, but Rowe had pushed him to his limits. "Damn man's a crook," Garrett had muttered just a few months before he disappeared. "Trying to charge me triple for feed like I'm some kind of fool." Sarah had pushed it out of her mind at the time. It seemed like nothing more than a bad business deal. But now, after everything that had happened, after Garrett's sudden disappearance, the name felt like a key she couldn't ignore. She spent the next few days digging into Rowe's background. She learned that he'd been fired from several other farms for similar complaints over pricing, deception, shady deals. There was more here, more than just a business transaction gone bad. But what did it mean? How did it tie into Garrett's disappearance? Sarah felt herself spiraling. She couldn't make sense of it all. There were too many unanswered questions, too many things that didn't fit. The more she uncovered, the more lost she felt. Was Garrett involved in something more dangerous than financial ruin? Was there someone else who wanted him gone? Or was it all just an unbearable combination of bad luck, stress, and poor decisions? Late one night, as Sarah sat at the kitchen table, the house silent around her, she stared at the stack of papers in front of her. Her hands trembled as she leafed through the documents, looking for something, anything that might make sense of the chaos. She knew Garrett better than anyone, yet now, he felt like a stranger. "I don't understand," she whispered, the words heavy in the stillness of the room. "What happened to you, Garrett?" The night stretched on, her her questions unanswered, her heart aching with the fear that she might never get the answers she needed. The land outside was dark and still, as if holding its breath, waiting for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. But as she looked out into the night, the emptiness of the land matched the emptiness inside her. She couldn't explain it, not yet. But she knew one thing for certain: there was something deeper behind Garrett's disappearance. And the closer she came to understanding it, the more terrifying it became. She wasn't ready for the truth, but she knew it was coming. Chapter ends with Sarah staring out into the dark, the weight of her own growing suspicions pressing down on her. The ranch, the land, Garrett, they were all tied together in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. But she would find out. She had to. The weeks since Garrett's disappearance had stretched into months, and now, as the anniversary of that fateful night loomed ahead, Sarah found herself standing on the edge of something she couldn't name. The relentless passage of time had carved an emptiness into her heart, a hollow that only grew deeper as each day passed without a word from her husband. It was early morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the Crawford Ranch. The land looked unchanged, untouched by the chaos that had consumed her life. The cattle grazed, the wind carried the scent of dry earth, and everything appeared as it should be, except it wasn't. Garrett's absence had left a scar that time couldn't heal, and Sarah felt the weight of it every time she stepped outside. She stood at the kitchen window, staring out at the ranch, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter, knuckles white. It had been so long now, 6 months. She'd tried to move forward, to find some sense of normalcy, but it felt like walking in a fog. She could barely remember what it felt like to hear Garrett's voice or see his face. The silence that had replaced him seemed to stretch out forever, a vast, endless void. But there was still that part of her, the stubborn, hopeful part that clung to the belief that maybe, just maybe, Garrett would return. Maybe he had just left for some reason she couldn't understand. Maybe the pressures of the ranch, the debts, the weight of everything, had driven him to walk away. But she couldn't accept that. She couldn't imagine a world without him. Not after everything they'd been through. Not after everything that had built together. That's when the phone call came. It was from her cousin in Oklahoma, a voice crackling over the line with excitement and disbelief. "I think I saw him, Sarah. I swear, it was him." For a moment, Sarah couldn't breathe. Her heart seemed to stop as the words sank in. Garrett, alive. Her mind raced. Could it be true? Could it really be him? Her cousin told her about a man she'd seen in a diner, a man who looked just like Garrett. Same height, same build, same worn, weathered face. He was tired, disheveled, but there was something about him, something in the way he moved, that made her cousin think of Garrett. He was just sitting there looking out the window. He paid for his coffee, stared for a while, and then left. Her cousin said, "Sarah, I really think it was him." The surge of hope that hit Sarah was overwhelming, like a wave crashing into her chest. She barely knew how to react. Could it really be Garrett? Could he have just disappeared without a word, only to resurface in a place she never thought to look? Without wasting another moment, she grabbed Ben, and together, they made the long drive to Oklahoma. Every mile felt like a heartbeat, quickening, in anticipation and desperation. As they arrived in the small town, Sarah's heart raced. Her eyes scanned every face, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. They went to the diner, the one where her cousin had seen the man, and Sarah's breath caught as she stepped through the door. But the reality she had hoped for began to crumble before her eyes. They spoke to the cashier, who confirmed the sighting. But when Sarah saw the security footage, all her hope dissolved. The man on the tape resembled Garrett just enough to give her a glimpse of what she wanted to believe. But it wasn't him. The face was blurry, the figure too vague to confirm. The man had paid for his coffee and left, just as her cousin had described. But the hope that had flared inside Sarah now flickered and died. It wasn't Garrett. The disappointment hit harder than anything she'd felt before. They'd driven all that way, believing that maybe, just maybe, they'd find him, that he'd walked away from everything only to return when he was ready. But now, the reality was crueler than anything she could have imagined. Garrett was still out there somewhere, lost, or worse, and the answers she desperately needed remained just out of reach. The drive back to Brewster County was long, silent. The weight of their failed search settled on Sarah like a thick blanket. Ben, too, seemed lost in his thoughts, his usual optimism swallowed by the crushing disappointment. They said little to each other, the silence between them stretching long and heavy, each of them grappling with their own feelings of loss, of helplessness. Back at the ranch, the relentless march of time continued. The bills piled up, the cows still needed to be fed, but Sarah couldn't focus on any of it. The uncertainty of Garrett's fate gnawed at her, the not knowing, the feeling that he could be out there, somewhere, needing help, and she couldn't reach him. Detective Corbin, meanwhile, had been quietly re-examining Garrett's financial records, trying to make sense of the puzzle that never seemed to fit. And it was then that he stumbled upon something that gave him pause. Garrett had been receiving a series of small, irregular cash payments over the past year, payments that didn't align with the usual rhythms of ranching life. They weren't from auctions or cattle sales. They were different, more personal in nature. Corbin stared at the deposits, the pattern suddenly clear. Something wasn't right. He had been so certain that Garrett's disappearance was a result of mounting debts and pressure. But now, looking at the records with fresh eyes, Corbin realized that the man he had been investigating might have been involved in something darker, something far beyond financial ruin. Had Garrett been caught up in something he couldn't escape? The thought sent a chill down Corbin's spine. Was it possible that Garrett's debts weren't the only thing driving him to disappear? Had there been a darker side to his life that Sarah had never known about? As the pieces of the puzzle began to shift in Corbin's mind, the case no longer felt like a simple disappearance. The reality was far more complicated. For Sarah, the hope that Garrett might still be out there had faded, but the mystery deepened. She had always known there was something more to his disappearance, but now it seemed that the truth was even more elusive than she could have ever imagined. She sat on the porch that evening staring out at the ranch. The land, once a symbol of their life together, now felt like a vast, lonely place. Garrett was still out there, but whatever had happened to him, whatever had pulled him away from everything he'd known, was slipping further from her grasp, and she had no way of knowing if she would ever get him back. The chapter ends with Sarah lost in her thoughts, as the fading light of day casts long shadows across the land. The mystery of Garrett's disappearance has deepened, and the emotional toll is taking its final toll on her, questions that have no answers. A husband lost, and a family torn between hope and despair. The desert stretched endlessly, a sea of sand and rock that seemed to go on forever, swallowing everything in its path. It was a place where silence reigned, where the earth seemed to hold secrets beneath its cracked, dusty surface. Maria Sanchez had lived in the area for years, and she knew the desert well. It was a place of solitude, where the wind whispered, and the sun burned everything it touched. She had been jogging along the familiar trail that snaked through the brush. Buster, her retired canine dog, trotting beside her. Buster had been with her for over a year, a rescue with a past steeped in duty. Once trained to detect human remains, he was now a companion in her daily runs. But his instincts had never dulled. That day, the air was thick with heat, the sun relentless in its assault on the land. The silence was deafening as Maria's feet crunched against the dry earth, the rhythm of her breath matching Buster's steady pace. But then, something changed. Buster suddenly stopped, his ears pinned back, his body tense. Maria pulled her attention from the path ahead, looking down at her dog. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, but Buster was already moving, his nose twitching as he bounded ahead. He wasn't just running, he was on a mission. "Buster, stop," Maria called, but the dog ignored her, his focus locked onto something in the distance. Maria's heart quickened as she jogged to catch up, her breath catching in her throat as she saw Buster digging furiously at a large rock formation. He pawed at the dirt, sending clouds of dust into the air. His movements were frantic, more urgent than Maria had ever seen before. "What's going on?" she murmured, fear creeping into her voice. She approached cautiously, her eyes scanning the ground, trying to make sense of what had gotten Buster so worked up. As she drew closer, her stomach sank. There was something off about the way the rocks were scattered, as though they had been disturbed. Buster continued to dig, his paws striking against something harder than the loose earth beneath him. Maria hesitated, her breath caught in her chest. This wasn't normal. She reached down, pulling him away gently, her hands shaking as she moved the rocks aside. The scent of dry earth filled the air, but beneath it, something else lingered, faint but unmistakable. The feeling of something hidden, something buried, and something left behind. Her heart pounded as she cleared away more dirt, and then her eyes fell upon it, something she could barely comprehend. Beneath the rocks, carefully placed in the shallow pit, were men's clothing, a worn brown jacket, faded blue jeans, and a light-colored button-up shirt, all neatly arranged, almost as if they had been placed there intentionally. And at the center of the bizarre burial was something that made Maria's blood run cold, a desert tortoise shell. It was old, weathered and covered in dust, but the unmistakable shape of the shell was clear. The tortoise's hard outer casing was wrapped in silver duct tape, just the kind of tape used in makeshift repairs. But that wasn't the worst part. Sitting on top of the shell, secured with more duct tape, was a cowboy hat. The hat was stained and misshapen, its crown punctured by a small hole. It was a symbol, something unsettling, and it sent a shiver down Maria's spine. Why? Why was this here? Maria's mind raced, her eyes flicking over the strange, almost ceremonial arrangement. It didn't make sense. It was a message, but from who? And why here, in the middle of the desert, where no one would find it unless they were looking for it? She knew she had to act fast. Her heart thudded in her chest as she reached for her phone, fingers trembling as she dialed 911. The dispatcher answered with a calm voice, but Maria couldn't contain her growing sense of dread. "Hi, this is Maria Sanchez. I'm out on the trail and I found something strange," she said, trying to steady her voice. "I'm with my dog, Buster. He uncovered a burial site. There's men's clothing, a tortoise shell, a cowboy hat taped to it." She hesitated for a moment, the weight of the situation sinking in. "Please, I need someone to come out here as the dispatcher promised to send help. Maria couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at the edge of something she wasn't prepared to understand. She moved back from the grave, keeping her eyes on Buster, who was still fixated on the spot where he had been digging. The dog's instincts had led them here, to a place that felt all too unnatural. Hours later, a sheriff's deputy arrived, a young officer barely a year into the job. His face was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the way his eyes scanned the scene, his unease palpable as he took in the strange, disturbing burial. He didn't speak much at first, but Maria could see the tension in his body as he crouched down, examining the men's clothing, the jacket, the hat, the way everything was arranged so methodically. It felt wrong, like a story being told in symbols that none of them could decipher. The deputy called for backup, and within an hour, small forensics team arrived. They worked quickly, moving the boulders aside, carefully cataloging the evidence. As a last stone was lifted, a pit about 4 feet long and 2 feet wide was revealed. Its contents strange, haunting, and still too cryptic for anyone to fully understand. The men's clothing, the duct-taped tortoiseshell, and the cowboy hat all pointed towards something. But Maria couldn't figure out what it was. Detective Miles Corbin, who eventually arrived on the scene. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp, taking in every detail with the kind of precision that only a seasoned investigator could possess. He walked around the site slowly, as though searching for answers in the dust, the clothes, the tortoise shell. When his gaze fell upon the clothing, his face shifted. He reached down, touching the jacket with gloved hands, turning it over. His eyes narrowed. He moved to the hat, and that's when it hit him, the unmistakable recognition. "This jacket," Corbin murmured under his breath. "I've seen this before." The cowboy hat, the jacket, it was all too familiar. It was Garrett Crawford's. The realization hit Corbin like a punch to the stomach. The case that had been a mystery for so long was no longer a simple disappearance. It was something far more sinister. Garrett Crawford wasn't just missing, he had been silenced. The discovery of the strange grave, the clothing, and the symbolic burial, it all pointed to a dark truth. Garrett had been killed. And now, it was no longer just a case of a missing person. It was a homicide investigation. Corbin stood in the desert, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. He knew that this discovery would change everything. The Crawford case, which had seemed so hopeless just days ago, had just taken an unexpected and terrifying turn. And the real mystery, what had happened to Garrett Crawford, was only just beginning to unravel. The chapter ends with Detective Corbin standing in the desert, the setting sun casting long shadows across the barren landscape. What had once seemed like an open question was now a dangerous path leading toward a hidden truth. The desert had always been a place of isolation, a landscape where secrets could vanish without a trace. But now, as Detective Corbin sat in his office flipping through the files on Garrett Crawford's case, he couldn't shake the feeling that the desert had kept something far darker than anyone had imagined. The investigation had been slow, piecing together bits of information, but nothing had ever truly made sense. The uncashed check, the strange burial site, the cryptic symbolism, it was all a puzzle that never quite fit together. But then, something unexpected happened, a phone call that would change the course of the case. It was from a DEA agent, a contact Corbin had worked with in the past. The agent had been following cartel activity in the region, and as soon as he heard about the bizarre burial, a tortoise shell wrapped in duct tape with a cowboy hat on top, he knew exactly what it. And then they're sending a message, the agent had said, his voice low and urgent. That's cartel language. It's what they do to informants, people who talk to the authorities. They call them rats, and the tortoise, it's a symbol for someone hiding someone who's betrayed them, a snitch. Corbin's stomach twisted. Garrett Crawford, a man who had lived his entire life on this land, had no known enemies. He was a rancher, a simple man trying to hold on to what was his. So why would the cartel have targeted him? The agent's words echoed in Corbin's mind. A snitch. He didn't want to believe it, but the more he thought about it, the more the pieces started to fall into place. Garrett's sudden disappearance, the strange burial, the tension in his finances, all of it pointed to something far darker than just a man losing his way. Corbin couldn't ignore it any longer. He pulled the financial records again, carefully combing through the small, unexplained cash deposits Garrett had received in the months leading up to his disappearance. The amounts weren't large, but they were irregular deposits of $500, sometimes $2,000, showing up at odd intervals. It was money that didn't come from the ranch or the cattle auctions. It didn't make sense, and yet, there it was. Where had it come from? It wasn't until Corbin started to look closer that a chilling thought began to form in his mind. What if Garrett had been involved with the cartel? What if the money had come from them? The thought hit him like a freight train, and it was all he could think about. Had Garrett been working with them in some capacity, maybe out of desperation, or had he just stumbled into something he couldn't escape? The evidence was mounting, but it wasn't enough. Corbin wasn't ready to jump to conclusions, not yet. He needed more. Meanwhile, in Brewster County, Sarah Crawford was in her own, the world of discovery. As the days passed, she continued to search for answers, digging deeper into her husband's final months. The more she uncovered, the more she realized that Garrett had been keeping secrets. She found a receipt tucked into a drawer, a small slip of paper that led to a shocking revelation. Garrett had refused to get involved in human trafficking. It was a brief note from a conversation with a man, someone who had offered him a way out of his financial troubles. The offer wasn't the kind of deal a man like Garrett would normally entertain, but there, written in his own hand, was the note. Not involved, no, it wasn't much, but it was enough to paint a picture of Garrett's character. He hadn't given in to the pressures of the cartel, hadn't taken their money or allowed them to use his ranch for their illegal activities. He had refused, and that refusal, Sarah realized, had likely cost him his life. The truth hit Sarah like a slap in the face. Garrett had stood up to the cartel, refused to be part of their world, and they had retaliated. They didn't just threaten him, they killed him. The emotional weight of the discovery was unbearable. Sarah sat in their home, the ranch surrounding her like a prison, knowing that Garrett's final act had been one of defiance. And yet, the fact that she had never seen it coming left her shaken to the core. Her husband, the man she thought she knew, had been caught in a world far beyond the simple troubles of their ranch. She couldn't stop thinking about the phone calls, the subtle hints, the way Garrett had been quieter in his final months. Had he known something? Had he been trying to protect her and Ben, trying to shield them from the storm that was coming? Or had he been trying to find a way out, a way to escape from the very people who would eventually take his life? As Corbin continued his investigation, he was drawn deeper into the cartel's web. His suspicions grew with every new lead. Garrett's financial records, the strange burial, the symbolism behind it, all it was becoming clearer with each passing day. Garrett Crawford hadn't just been another victim of financial ruin. He had been caught in a deadly game, a game that had nothing to do with ranching and everything to do with survival. It wasn't just that Garrett had gotten involved with the cartel, it was that he had become a target for standing up to them, or refusing to cross the line. And that, Corbin realized, was what had led to his death. He hadn't been a part of their operation, but they had marked him as an obstacle that needed to be eliminated. Corbin's gut told him the case was no longer just a missing persons case. It was a homicide investigation, tied to a dangerous world of drugs and violence. Garrett's refusal to back down had sealed his fate. The more Corbin uncovered, the more the story came into focus. Garrett had been a man of principle, a man who had tried to protect his family, his land, and his dignity. But in a world like the one he had been thrust into, principles meant nothing. As Corbin stood in his office, the weight of the case pressing down on him, he knew one thing for sure: Garrett Crawford had been a victim of circumstances far beyond his control. And now, the investigation had to shift into something darker, something far more dangerous. The chapter ends with Corbin staring at the files, spread out before him, each piece of evidence pulling him deeper into a world he never expected to uncover. Garrett's death had been a message, a brutal, final act. And Corbin knew that this was only the beginning of a story that would take him further into the heart of darkness than he ever anticipated. The sun set outside the window, casting long shadows across the room as Corbin made a decision. The case had changed. And now, the hunt for the truth would take him into the underbelly of the cartel's world that, like Garrett, he could never walk away from. It had been for years, since Garrett Crawford vanished. 4 years of silence. 4 years of unanswered questions that gnawed at Sarah's soul, eating away at the pieces of a life she once knew to be true. The search, the endless interviews, the cold files piling up, nothing had ever felt like it was leading to anything. Nothing had ever given her the peace she so desperately craved, until the call came. That it was an unexpected one, coming from an unlikely source, a man named Hector Morales, a drug trafficker serving time in a federal penitentiary. He had seen the news about Garrett's case, and something about it had stirred. Something in him, something he couldn't ignore. The call was brief. The voice on the other end of the line was raw, urgent, like a man who had been carrying a secret for far too long. "I know what happened to Garrett," Morales said, his voice shaking with a strange mix of fear and guilt. "I know what they did to him." Sarah's heart raced as the words sank in. This wasn't just some random tip, this was a confession. The truth, she realized, was finally within her reach. Morales told them everything. He had been part of a cartel operation that had used Garrett's ranch as a staging point. The cartel, with its dark influence, had seen Garrett as a perfect target, a man struggling, desperate to save his failing ranch. They had approached him with an offer he couldn't refuse. They offered him money, a way to pay off his debts, a way to keep his land. But in return, they wanted something far darker than anything Garrett could have imagined. They needed the barn, Morales explained, to store their drugs, to move their shipments through. Garrett agreed. He was desperate. He had no other choice. But there was a line Garrett wouldn't cross. When the cartel made another demand, a demand that no decent man could live with, Garrett had refused. They wanted to use his barn to hold people, women, children, victims of human trafficking. And Garrett, despite everything, despite the overwhelming pressure to comply, refused. Morales paused, a sigh of regret passing through the phone line. That's when they decided he had to go. He was a liability. He knew too much. They couldn't let him walk away. The words hit Sarah like a fist to the gut. Her world, already torn apart by the mystery of Garrett's disappearance, suddenly became darker, more twisted than she had ever imagined. He hadn't just vanished into thin air, he had been taken, torn away. And the reason why was as horrifying as it was heartbreaking. Morales spoke of Garrett's kidnapping, the brutal days that followed. They tortured him, he said, his voice quieter now as if the memory still haunted him. They wanted him to sign the deed to the ranch, to give it to them. But he refused. He wouldn't break. The confession was unbearable, each word deepening the wound in Sarah's heart. The man she had loved, the man she had thought of as unshakable, had fought for everything: his land, his family, his dignity, even when faced with a choice that no one should ever have to make. But it wasn't just that. Garrett had refused. It wasn't just the cartel's brutal reaction. What came next, according to Morales, was even worse. They didn't just kill him. Sarah Morales continued, his voice barely above a whisper. They disposed of his body in the desert, buried him where no one would find him, and then they left a message. The clothes they buried in the desert, that was a warning to others in the cartel. A message that said, "This is what happens when you cross us." A cold chill ran through Sarah. She had always known something terrible had happened to Garrett, but to hear it, to know the depth of the violence he had endured, it shattered what little was left of her. Her mind struggled to comprehend it. She couldn't understand how a world so vile had intersected with her husband's simple life. The burial, the strange scene with the tortoise shell, the cowboy hat, it had all been part of the cartel's twisted ritual, a message for anyone who might dare to oppose them. But Garrett, with his stubborn pride, had been too much of a man to back down, and in the end it had cost him everything. Corbin, who had been listening in on the call, sat silently for a moment as the gravity of the situation settled over him. He had suspected that Garrett's disappearance was tied to something bigger than financial ruin, but this was far darker than he could have imagined. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. Garrett Crawford had been killed because he had refused to let the cartel use him. He had been murdered as an example to others, and the worst part was, no one could have predicted it. Back at the ranch, Sarah was numb. She felt like the ground beneath her was slipping away, and yet, at the same time, it all made sense. Garrett had never been the type to walk away from his responsibilities, to abandon his family or his land. The fact that he had stood up to the cartel, refused to be part of something so horrific, it made her proud, but the cost had been too high. Ben, who had been in the room when the call came through, stood frozen, his face pale, his eyes wide, as if he, too, were trying to make sense of what had been revealed. "Dad fought them, didn't he?" Ben whispered, his voice breaking. Sarah closed her eyes, tears slipping down her face. "He did, Ben. He fought them all the way to the end." But even in that moment she knew there was no comfort. Garrett wasn't coming back. The man who had fought so hard to protect his family, to protect them from the forces he never should have had to face, was gone, and nothing would ever be the same. The call ended and Sarah was left standing in the midst of the wreckage of her world. For 4 years, she had wondered, searched, hoped for something, anything that would bring Garrett back. But now, there was nothing left but the cold truth. The man she had loved had died trying to protect what mattered most, and in doing so, he had become a casualty of a war she never even knew existed. The chapter ends with Sarah, alone, sitting on the porch, the setting sun casting long shadows over the land. The truth was out, and the world she once knew, her life, her family, her future, had been irrevocably changed. The pain was unbearable, but at least now, she knew what had happened to Garrett, and in that knowledge there was a sense of finality. The days after Garrett's death blended together, each one darker and harder to face than the last. The weight of it, or the pain of losing him, the overwhelming sorrow of knowing the man she had loved was gone, was crushing. But that wasn't all. There was something else, something even heavier that Sarah couldn't shake. The future that had once seemed so full of promise, so full of hope, now felt like it was crumbling to dust. Sarah and Ben stood side by side, trying to hold it together, but each day felt like an uphill battle. The ranch, their life, was falling apart. They had always relied on Garrett to steer them through the hard times. He was their anchor. Now, with him gone, they were adrift. The debts, the bills, the endless struggle to keep the ranch alive, they couldn't do it without him. Not anymore. Sarah spent hours each day in the house, going through paperwork she never thought she'd have to face. The bank was breathing down their necks, and the realization hit harder than any loss. The ranch, the land that had been in Garrett's family for generations, was slipping through their fingers. They couldn't keep it. They didn't have the means. The decision to sell off part of the land came like a slow, inevitable wave, each day that passed making it more impossible to hold on. Sarah and Ben watched as the surveyors arrived, marking the land that had once been their home, their future. Each stake driven into the earth felt like a stake through Sarah's heart. Every piece of land sold was a piece of Garrett's legacy, torn away. Ben was quieter now, his face once full of the carefree energy of a young man looking to make his way, was now marked by the weight of responsibility that had been forced upon him too soon. He had dropped out of college to help his mother hold everything together, but the grief, the frustration, and the helplessness had already started to chip away at him. "I don't know how much more I can take, Mom," he said one evening, his voice raw as he sat at the kitchen table. "I just don't know what to do anymore." Sarah looked at him, her heart breaking as she saw the boy she'd raised become someone else entirely. She could see it in his eyes, the exhaustion, the resignation, the life that had been taken from them all too soon. "I know, Ben, I know," she whispered, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her own voice trembled as the tears that had been held back for so long threatened to spill. She tried to be strong. She had to be. But the truth was, nothing was the same anymore. Garrett's death had shattered the foundation of their family. They weren't just grieving a loss, they were facing the collapse of everything they had worked so hard to preserve. Each piece of land they sold felt like a betrayal. It wasn't just property, it was history. It was Garrett's grandfather's legacy, his father's. The ranch was a part of them, a part of their story. And now, it was slipping through their fingers, just as Garrett had. The sound of the auctioneer's voice echoed through the house as Sarah sat alone, going through the final papers. The auction was happening soon, and there was nothing left to do but sign the documents. It was the end of an era. The land that had once been a symbol of their strength, their identity, was now up for sale. "I'm so sorry, Garrett," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "I tried." She had tried. She had fought with everything she had to keep the ranch, to hold on to the life they had built. But without Garrett, it had all become too much. The debts, the land, the ranch, it was all just too much. And now, all she had left were the memories. As the days passed, Sarah found herself spending more and more time in the barn, the place where Garrett had last been, where he had worked and toiled. The barn, once filled with the sounds of Garrett's quiet determination, now felt empty. There was nothing left, just dust, silence, and the ghosts of the past. She walked through the space slowly, her fingers brushing against the wooden beams that had been a part of Garrett's world. The tools he had used, now forgotten, hung on the walls, their rusted edges reflecting the light that streamed in through the cracks in the barn's walls. Everything felt still. Everything felt lost. She sat on a stool in the corner, staring at the empty space where Garrett had spent so many hours fixing the tractors, repairing the fences, keeping the ranch running. It was here, in this very spot, where he had vanished without a trace. And now, it was here where she was left to pick up the pieces. Tears welled in her eyes as she thought about the man Garrett had been. Strong, determined, stubborn in the best ways. He had refused to give in, refused to let the world break him. And even now, his refusal to compromise had cost him everything. But it had also been the thing that made him who he was. And it was that strength, that unwavering dedication to his principles that Sarah admired most. Even in the face of death, Garrett had held on to what mattered. He had never given in to the cartel, never allowed them to use him for their own gain. "I'm proud of you, Garrett," she whispered into the silence of the barn, her voice trembling. "You didn't let them win." But as the words left her lips, the weight of the truth settled over her like a suffocating blanket. Garrett had paid the ultimate price for his integrity, and now, the future they had once imagined was lost. She stood up slowly, wiping the tears from her cheeks, and made her way to the door. The wind was picking up outside, the dust swirling in the air. She looked back at the barn one last time, the barn that had once held the sound of Garrett's steady hands, of his determination. Now it was just a place of memories as she stepped out into the open air. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land, Garrett's land. But it wasn't the same anymore. It wasn't home, not without him standing there, in the shadow of the barn where it all began. Sarah realized something she hadn't been able to fully accept before. Garrett's death had changed everything. The ranch, their life, their future, it was all gone. And no matter how much she had fought to keep it, some things were simply beyond her control. She stood there, looking out over the land, the wind carrying the faint scent of the earth, and she let the tears fall. For Garrett, for their lost future, for the legacy that had slipped away like sand through her fingers. And for the first time since his death, Sarah finally allowed herself to grieve, to mourn the man she had lost, the life they had lost, and the future that would never be. The chapter ends with Sarah standing alone on the land, the wind swirling around her, her figure cast in the long, lonely shadows of the setting sun. The days stretched on, each one blending into the next. But for Sarah, the weight of her grief never, it seems, to lessen. Garrett's death had broken her, shattered her world in ways she hadn't thought possible. But there was no time to stop, no time to dwell on the pain. The authorities had done their best, but they still couldn't bring Garrett's killers to justice. The men who had torn him from their lives had vanished into the shadows, swallowed by the vast, dangerous world of the cartel. And yet, despite the frustration, despite the anger, something changed. The collapse of the cartel's operation in The Reginan outcome that had been set in motion by the investigation into Garrett's death became a bittersweet victory. It was small consolation for the loss of Garrett, but it was something that could help others, something that would, perhaps, prevent the same fate from befalling someone else. But that wasn't enough to bring Garrett back. It wasn't enough to make the world right again. The silence of the desert had never felt so loud. Sarah spent her days wandering the empty house, the place that had once been full of life, now hollowed out by tragedy. The ranch pride, their shared dream, had become a tomb. The once vibrant land, now marked with empty fields and fading memories, felt like a place she could no longer belong. The weight of her responsibilities, the endless bills, the need to keep the ranch afloat, all of it pressed down on her, reminding her that the world kept turning even when she wanted to scream for it to stop. But the case was still open, still unsolved. The killers, the men who had orchestrated Garrett's murder, had slipped away, hidden behind the faceless world of the drug trade. The truth, at least, the final part of it, was beyond her reach. The law had done what it could, but the shadows were too deep, the men too elusive. She knew there would be no justice, not the kind she had hoped for. There would be no courtroom, no trial, no moment when the people responsible would be brought to their knees. The authorities had tried, they had fought the shadows, but in the end, the only thing they had achieved was the dismantling of a piece of the cartel's empire, a small victory in the grand scheme of things, but one that couldn't fill the void left by Garrett's death. Sarah stood in the empty kitchen one evening, staring out at the land that stretched before her. The sun was setting, casting long, amber shadows across the earth. The familiar sight of the land they had fought so hard to keep was now tinged with loss. The ranch was slipping away, the dreams Garrett had once nurtured slowly fading. She felt as though she was losing everything: her home, her past, her future. But even as she stood there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, something shifted inside her, a quiet realization that had been slowly creeping up on her over the past few months. Garrett had fought until the very end. He had stood against the cartel, refusing to bend to their will, refusing to let them use his land for their nefarious purposes. And in the end, it was that very courage, that refusal to compromise, that had cost him his life. But she could never be angry at him for that, not for standing by his principles, not for dying with honor, even if it meant he would never return home. Her hand trembled as she gripped the windowsill, her gaze fixed on the fading light. The land, once a symbol of their future together, now held nothing but memories of Garrett's laugh, of the way he'd look at her after a long day's work, tired but content. It was still there, the essence of him, woven into every corner of the property. "I love you, Garrett," she whispered into the empty room, the words barely audible. "I will always love you." Her voice broke as the final words left her lips. She turned, wiped the tears from her eyes, and walked slowly to the door. She knew there was no turning back now. There was no way to fix what had been broken, but there was something else. She had to do something that would give her peace. The sun had almost set when Sarah arrived at the barn, the same barn where Garrett had worked, where she had last seen him. The barn that had once been full of his quiet determination, his steady hands. It stood there, just as it had always been, but now it felt empty. Its once welcoming presence now a reminder of what was lost. The wind whistled softly through the cracks in the wood, as though the barn itself was mourning. Sarah stepped inside, her footsteps echoing through the quiet space. The walls seemed to close in on her, but she didn't mind. She had spent countless hours here, side by side with Garrett, watching him work, listening to the hum of the machines. She could still hear him in her mind, still see him as he was before everything changed. She walked to the corner where Garrett had spent his last moments, her fingers trailing along the worn wood of the barn's frame. She closed her eyes, letting the memories wash over her. His voice, his smile, the quiet moments they had shared. It was all gone now. But somehow, in this empty space, she could still feel him. "I'm proud of you, Garrett," she whispered to the air, the words hanging in the stillness. "You did what was right, even when it cost you everything." She stood there, in the place where Garrett had last worked, where his hands had shaped their future, and she found a strange kind of peace. It wasn't the peace she had hoped for when where Garrett came back, where everything was right again, but it was a peace that came from understanding, from knowing that Garrett had done what he believed in, and in the end, that had been enough. As the last rays of the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, Sarah stood alone in the barn, the silence surrounding her. The weight of everything was still there, the grief, the loss, the knowledge that her life had been changed forever. But for the first time since Garrett's death, she felt something else, a quiet strength, a deep, unshakable understanding that his legacy, his courage, his refusal to compromise, those things would live on. The chapter ends with Sarah standing in the barn, her face illuminated by the last light of the day. She takes a deep breath, her gaze lingering on the empty space where Garrett had once stood, and in that moment, she understands. He may be gone, but his strength, his principles. As love they would never fade, and in that she found her peace.